Hello, Henry. How are you doing?
Not too bad, not too bad. Surviving the summer Washington heat.
Oh, yes. I just got back from Europe last week where they had to deal with European heat. It was just as hot there as it was here.
I don't know about that. I think Washington heat is particularly miserable and particularly humid. You were in France, was it, or?
I was in Italy and then somewhat involuntarily in France due to the sublime incompetence of Air France. But in Italy, it was 95 to 99. But you're right, there wasn't that much humidity. And at Paris, I have to admit, the weather was lovely, so no complaints there.
And Italy has compensating advantages that I'm afraid Washington D.C., while it's a very nice city, does not.
This is quite true. And yeah, there's no denying that. But having gotten back here, I now see that this morning I wake up and there is a big story in the Washington Post.
A pretty enormous story. I think it's a fun story and an interesting story, and of course the first installment of what seems to be a set of sort of very interesting pieces. Mark Ambinder had a piece suggesting that all of Washington was on tenterhooks, waiting to see what happened. And I think you had a blog post more or less along the same lines this morning.
Yes. So I mean, this is a mother of a piece. I mean, it's 4,500 words at least, and this is just part one, and it appears to be part of a 2-year effort by Dana Priest and Bill Arkin from the Washington Post. I have to say, Dana Priest in particular is a reporter without peer. She was the reporter who I believe broke the rendition story, the sort of black sites for rendition of terrorist suspects. So the story is about I guess for lack of a better putting it, this sort of skiff complex, the national security complex that has been created in the wake of the 9/11 attacks and exists as this sort of multi-hydra-headed operation consisting of over 1,200 government agencies and I believe over 1,400 private sector agencies, all of which are devoted to their homeland security, counterterrorism, or intelligence. And basically the broad brushstrokes of the story is that the system is completely beyond control. And I don't mean that in the sense of beyond control in that it's devouring everything. It's beyond control in the sense of no one seems to be able to have a grip on the massive inflows of information that are coming in. And then the story also talks about the sort of absurdities that have cropped up as a result of the past 9 years. Things like 4-star generals insisting that they have their own intelligence and security apparatus because every other 4-star general has one. And the sort of standard bureaucratic mythologies that take place when you've got large amounts of ready cash flowing around. There was some concern, I think, before the story was coming out that this was going to be a national security breach of some kind. But I have to say, one of the refreshing things I've seen so far, at least in today's reaction to the story, is that everyone across the political spectrum agrees this wasn't a national security breach. They got everything from open source sites, and that it's a useful flashlight onto an area where not a lot of people know a great deal.
Well, one of the things I thought was most interesting about the story was the graph that went along with it. Chris Shea has a blog, Brainiac, where he basically said that the interesting thing about the graph is precisely how incomprehensible it is and how impossible it was for the Washington Post's graphics people very clearly to actually give you an illustration which showed you what the hell this was going on. So you get this graph, this chart, and sort of which really gives you an impression of overwhelming and incomprehensible bureaucratic activity. And I think this is, I guess, so this certainly rings true to me from what I know of the bureaucratic backstory. The one thing I would have liked to see more of in the piece, and perhaps that comes later, is an account of the more specific account of the bureaucratic fights that led up to this. Because really, I think a lot of this, it's a response to the failures of the September 11th Commission agenda to actually take place. Basically, what you had, the September 11th Commission rightly recognized all of these problems of people not talking to each other, stovepiping, institutional proliferation and whatever, and said that they wanted to create a new structure with the Director of National Intelligence, which was supposed to bring all of this stuff to organize it and to make sure that some of this redundancy got eliminated. But they made it absolutely clear, and the chairs made it absolutely clear that this position was only going to work if this position had real clout, which means, of course, in bureaucratic terms. It would have A, control over who gets what money, and B, over who gets hired and fired in the different agencies. And Donald Rumsfeld didn't like this. He fought an extremely successful bureaucratic rearguard action. Rumsfeld, of course, being a notoriously proficient bureaucratic infighter, to make sure that the Director of National Intelligence position got gutted. And so I think a lot of what we see here, this proliferation, is a response to the failure a number of years ago to try and impose some order on this, and the incentives that this offers, as you say, for everybody, every Tom, Dick and Harry in the military and also in other parts of the intelligence community, to create their own private fiefdoms and empire without any real supervision.
I think it's even worse than that, because the other thing that I think the most interesting details in the story that was out today was the notion that after every subsequent failure, what would inevitably happen is that people will go in front of Congress and say, well, you know what, we need to set up a special task force to deal with this particular terrorism problem. And of course, we need more resources thrown at it. And I've got this laundry list of policies that we had always wanted implemented anyway, and now would be a great time to implement them. So, after the Nigerian, for example, who got exposed on Christmas Day, trying to explode up the airliner, you see this sort of thing happen. You saw it happen. I assume you're going to see it happen after the Times Square incident. And in some ways, this is a replay that goes back to the initial USA Patriot Act, which was passed only a month after 9/11, and which in many ways really consisted of sort of a laundry list of various agencies' wish lists in terms of getting access to information. And let me add, by the way, that in saying this, some of these instances were quite well supported. I mean, there was valid reasons for having this passed, but in some ways, they didn't have anything new in these requests. These were old requests that simply because the political environment had changed, were then able to get them. So, I mean, in some ways, the disturbing thing is the pathology seems to repeat itself over and over and over again. And then the question, of course, is, and I'd be very curious to see what the political impact of these stories will have on the existing national security apparatus. I have to say, one of the things, again, I really do find mildly encouraging so far, and again, this is just based on the first cycle of reactions, is I haven't seen a partisan split on this thing. I've seen both, sort of conservatives and liberals saying this is something we got to take seriously.
I guess I'm a little more skeptical than you on that, because I don't think that there's, I don't think there's a partisan split on this. But so I think that the issue of a sort of big ticket reform for this, it's kind of like the issue of yes, we need to reform waste in government. Everybody agrees in abstract. Getting rid of waste in government is absolutely awesome, but when you get to sort of cut down to the specifics, people, so every program has its institutional defender, and one of the things that sort of is really sort of I think very clear is the ways, and again that I hope gets developed more in the later forms of the piece, is the dysfunctional relationship between huge parts of the defense community and Congress. And here we're not only talking about missile programs or fighter programs or whatever. We're talking about these programs as also being a way of handing out the pork. Late, unlamented John Mercer was up to his eyes in a whole bunch of this stuff. There's some pretty dubious Beltway bandit companies, which, as I recall, relocated in his district specifically to take advantage of boondoggles that he set up. And so a lot of these programs are, I think, pretty directly the result of some sort of congenial political relationships, which I really don't think are going to get sorted out. And this is also, I think, one of the clarion calls of conservatives is always to eliminate government waste, but when it comes to cutting stuff that's happening through the Pentagon, they tend to back off pretty quickly. And this, I think, is the paradigmatic example of what happens within this area, which really is sort of terribly murky, because the lines of responsibility are so attenuated, because so much of this stuff is happening either in the black budget or in places that are not easily exposed to the sort of public light. It becomes very, very easy for all sorts of crazy and wasteful stuff to happen without anybody actually observing. I think the classic example of this a number of years ago was that incredibly gold-plated headquarters which the National Reconnaissance Agency managed to build for itself. With some sort of, as I recall, literally hundreds of millions of dollars being spent on sort of pretty ludicrously over sort of built luxurious quarters, and so because it's part of the black budget, nobody much notices. There's not much on sort of public debate, and so it's very easy for this stuff to get through.
Okay, I'll cite a slightly more optimistic note based on a few things. First, as I said, you're absolutely right that the danger in sort of going after attacking the budget on this is that you'll be accused of being soft on the war on terror or soft on terrorism or what have you. And in that sense, what I do find interesting is that sort of the people who have commented on this so far, at let's say the Weekly Standard or Hot Air, places that would ordinarily be much, much more robust in terms of supporting any kind of effort against terrorism, no matter how wasteful or how daunting the budget, have basically said this is a useful story and something needs to be done about it. Now, you're right, that might not translate into anything concrete. On the other hand, we're speaking about a week or two after the financial regulation bill got passed. And this is a bill that I actually think by the standard, nostrums of political science should not have contained what it wound up containing.
Yeah.
Which is it wound up actually being much harder on the financial sector than I think anyone would have predicted 6 months ago. And I think this is true for a lot of reasons, one of which was just unremitting public hostility to what had happened over the previous few years. The SEC indictment of Goldman Sachs would certainly help, sustain momentum for these kinds of things. One of the things I wonder is whether or not you're seeing a similar kind of groundswell for scaling back the national security state. We can point to isolated bits of data. The Michael Steele comment about how Afghanistan is now Obama's war. I think there's a front page story in Newsweek now from Richard Haas saying, let's get out of Afghanistan. A general, I guess for lack of a better way of putting it, fatigue with the ongoing wars in both Afghanistan and Iraq. And then the fact that you've got Bob Gates saying, this tap of funds has got to be turned off. And this all, of course, gets tied into this question of if you're really going to engage in greater amounts of fiscal austerity, one of the few big-ticket things you're going to have to tackle has got to be the national security establishment. Now, you're right. I mean, in some ways, much more powerful than the financial sector or whatever Israel lobby you think exists, you don't ever fuck with the Pentagon. And so, without question, that is in some ways the biggest, and most powerful interest group out there. But that said, I do wonder whether this is one of those things where you have sort of a signal moment, and there might actually be some kind of groundswell for greater, for at least some significant cutbacks. I mean, and furthermore, one last point on this, which is, I certainly applaud the Priest and Arkin study and paper, and one of the things they talk a lot about is sort of redundancy and waste. I think there's no doubt that from reading the story, there's redundancy run amok. But that said, I actually want a little redundancy in my national security state, in the sense that you want multiple agencies focusing on the same problem, in that hopefully something that, let's say, might pass the views of one agency gets caught by the other one. And that way fewer sort of, terrorist enterprises or other, potential threats to national security manage to go through every single filter in the government. Now, I think reading the story, it's clear we're way past that point. You can scale back a little bit on what's being spent, but I don't want to scale back too much, I guess.
Okay, well, again, when we'll get into the financial stuff in a moment, and I agree, it's a very, very interesting counterpoint to a lot of this. But I guess here are two reasons for being more skeptical about it. First of all, the scale of the task that would actually have to be undertaken if we wanted to have a efficient and well-functioning intelligence and information sharing establishment is just phenomenal. So if you read, for example, the Merkel Foundation issues regular reports on this, which I think are pretty, they've been calling for years for a proper infrastructure so that even government agencies could actually begin to talk to each other. This has not been accomplished in the last 10 years. You have multiple redundant information systems, none of which can talk to each other. You've got classification schemes involving literally hundreds of different levels of classification, each of sort of different part of the bureaucracy having its own classification scheme. This makes it incredibly difficult to try and figure out how you can share information across the bureaucracy. And so I think the real problem here is that trying to reform this stuff really requires, I think, a massive, a really, really massive material effort, which is going to take years, which is going to take hundreds of billions of dollars, which is going to sort of tread on a hell of a lot of toes. And I'm a little bit skeptical. I agree with you in general about the financial regulations. I'm a little bit skeptical about whether or not the long-term consequences of that will be all that wonderful. But I am quite skeptical that this is really going to, that we're really going to see anything that sort of really amounts to solid root and branch reform of the kind that you would like to see. And here I think that that you want to turn to people like Jacob Hacker and Paul Pearson, historical institutionalists, who talk about the ways in which institutions develop by layering. And very frequently it's very hard to try and sort of get rid of an existing institution. So you try to layer in another institution on top of that and hope the hell that works. Sometimes the layering institution can replace the existing institution. More often, or very often rather, it can just become another accretion of bureaucracy, and that's what we're seeing here. And finally, I agree with you in principle on the idea that it would be great to have a whole bunch of different competing agencies, each of them fighting it out to sort of provide information, whatever. But it's but as you said in your post, and I thought at the beginning of your post I agreed with, but then I thought that the optimistic note towards the end I did not agree with. Many of the enabling conditions which you'd want to see for that happening simply are not present here. You need to have, if that's going to work, you need to have some sort of a body which can sort of usefully filter through and sift through this stuff at the top to make sure that the actionable information gets to where it needs to get. You don't have that. You need to have interchange happening at the lower level so that people bounce each other's ideas against each other. You don't get that. And you need to have also some accountability from the quote customers unquote, and you don't get that. So my worry is that with a system like that, what you do not get is you don't get the kind of sort of people checking on each other and finding stuff that other people missed. Instead, you get customer-driven intelligence. You get Doug Feiss setting up his shop because he doesn't like what the CIA is telling him. So he says, okay, let's set up a new intelligence shop, which is going to tell us what we wanted to hear in order to justify the actions that we want to take in any event. This is perhaps the first time that the words Doug Feiss and intelligence have been used in the same sentence, but you get the drift of what I'm saying.
Yeah. No, these are all excellent points, and I have to admit, I can even lard on two more notes of pessimism, to counter my initial optimism. The first is that, as you point out, the bureaucratic cultures, the organizational cultures involved in the national security apparatus are so strong and so divisive in some ways that even prior efforts to try to get these people to engage in any kind of interagency cooperation has been close to nil, and Amy Ziegert has written a couple of books on this point. The second one, and actually this is the thing that I realize might be somewhat more disturbing, is that in some ways FinReg was different because congressmen were going to get political credit if they actually tackled the financial sector. In other words, by doing this, Blanche Lincoln helped her own cause in her Senate race, and Barney Frank has certainly not hurt himself from embracing reform as well. This, on the other hand, this is a much more thankless task because in most situations they probably won't be able to hold real public hearings and score political points that way. This is the sort of thankless job that most members of Congress don't want because unless they get an actual final bill done, most of the spade work done between now and then will not see the light of day, and therefore they're not going to get a lot of credit for that. So that is another note of pessimism because you want the political incentives to be such that Congress has an incentive to get involved in this. So unfortunately, you might be right on this. I think in some ways the real big question on this is going to be the extent to which the American public ties up this issue with one of two frames. The first is we got to keep ourselves safe, in which case they're probably going to just slough it off. Or the second is runaway government spending, in which case then you might actually see somewhat more political momentum, and political momentum from multiple different sources, not just sort of good government liberals, but also, Tea Party conservatives saying, look, we got to get a handle on our government again.
Well, maybe what you need is a bit of healthy paranoia about the kind of stuff that the state can do, and maybe that will help justify things. As I say, I remain pretty skeptical about this, but I was pretty skeptical about FinReg too, so maybe,
we can be a little more optimistic.
Yeah.
Speaking of pessimism, there has been a raging economic battle going on over sort of next steps with regard to the sluggish economy, and it appears that the forces of austerity are triumphing over the forces of Keynes.
Well, that's my impression at the moment, and seeing that I have to write an article for a project that you're organising precisely on this topic, it's been occupying a fair amount of my thought over the last couple of months. The article will come in, I promise. But I guess there was a pretty interesting exchange, a back and forth between Paul Krugman and Tyler Cowen over the last couple of days. Basically, Tyler writes this piece for the New York Times, which is more or less setting out the German view of things. He was saying that Germany has some justification for not necessarily being all that excited about the idea of Keynesian spending, that it's that the German economy is going gangbusters, especially in stuff like machinery production, and that it really that people should not be calling upon Germany to change its tune. There's a strong implication there that people should instead be copying the kinds of stuff that Germany is doing. And Paul Krugman writes this piece responding, which concentrates on Tyler's use of a particular moment in German history, German reunification, when Germany poured huge amounts of money into basically integrating former Eastern Germany into the country. And in Tyler's argument, he says this is an example of how fiscal policy did not work out all that well for the Germans, but Paul basically argues that this was not, in fact, sort of fiscal policy in a Keynesian sense, that really sort of fiscal policy is really only appropriate under a specific set of conditions, basically when you're in this liquidity trap, when monetary policy doesn't work, and government spending is the only way that you can really get the forces of aggregate demand primed to go again. So it's I think an interesting exchange because this is a set of debates which is, shall we say, a little bit heated, and Paul certainly doesn't pull his punches on these things. He's fairly critical of Tyler, but I think by his standards, he's this is basically a love pat. But you actually have this sort of back and forth over the sort of underlying issues where people are not shouting at each other, but instead engaging in argument. I think that they're missing out on the sort of real topic that they potentially disagree on. But I'd like to hear maybe what you think about it first before jumping into that.
Well, I agree with you that, I mean, by Paul Krugman standards, this was just a love pat to Tyler. It's clear that Krugman respects Cowen, and I, in some ways, I understand his intellectual frustration because, Krugman has been sounding the clarion call for we need to have a bigger boost in aggregate demand for 18 months now, and no one's listening to him. So I can't blame him for that. Where I think he perhaps misread what Tyler was saying, however, is that I think Cowen's point in that article was not so much that you can replicate, that you look at the German experience of 1990 and think, oh, it's exactly like the experience of now, but rather that from the German perspective, the two signal moments that sort of inform their thinking on this, even if it's not actually the most accurate way of thinking about it, is the 1990 episode where it was the only post-war moment where the Bundesbank sort of embraced inflationary policies because of the one-to-one Ostmark to Deutschmark policy, and then, of course, the 1920s hyperinflation episode. And so it's not completely, it's pretty understandable why the Germans think the way they're thinking on this. I think what's more interesting to me is that Cowen was trying to point out that there are aspects of the German model that might be embraced by by many countries, including the United States, that don't have anything to do with Keynesianism, but has things to do with microeconomic policies that might facilitate things like more flexible labor markets, greater investment in training, greater investment in the research infrastructure, and a more dynamic focus on exports. That these policies might, in and of themselves, also lead to a healthier and more robust economy.
Well, here, okay, well, there are a couple of things that are going on. First,
Yeah.
I should say, so the one area where I disagree with Tyler a little bit, in a later blog post, which is, so again, a sort of a friendly disagreement blog post rather than a, I'm going to sort of try to fill you full of holes blog post. Tyler says, so that one of the things about Paul Krugman that he finds interesting is that Krugman and other people in this debate are all focused on Keynesianism, and that there's another form of social democracy which people can embrace. There are other forms of social democracy out there which are, and the European, the German one being a very good example of this, and European social democracy effectively being somewhat different. And I think that this is true up to a point, but I think that the point here is not so much, I guess the point here is that Germany looks social democratic from a US point of view, but it isn't actually all that social democratic. If you look at really what's been driving it over the last couple of years, and in particular this hostility to Keynesianism, it's actually a different form, it's a form of conservatism. It's a different form of conservatism than the US form of conservatism. It's much less interested in pure free markets. It's strongly attached to this idea that markets need to be embedded in a social framework in order to prevent them from attacking the basis of culture and society. But it still is fundamentally a small c conservatism as opposed to being an actual form of social democracy. And when you get to the stuff about about supply side things, here, and this is my personal take on this as somebody who studies this stuff, I'm a European political economy guy insofar as I'm anything, is that the German lesson, it's a pretty ambiguous lesson, which is to say, sure, they do some things a lot better than the US, but that's because the US really sucks when it comes to various forms of supply side policy, training, and this kind of stuff. So it's hard to do actually any worse than the US when it comes to, for example, trying to make sure that unemployed people get retraining and so on. The real models that I think are the interesting and the attractive models, and perhaps more attractive to libertarians as well, are models like, for example, Denmark, where you see this, on the one hand, there's this very, very strong social welfare system, which really provides a lot of protection, a lot of tries to make sure that people stay unemployed for as little time as possible, that they get all of the training that they need to get to go back on the job market. But on the other hand, you don't have the kinds of extensive forms of job protection that you get in many European states, and you have you really have an emphasis on creating a free moving market. And this is something which I think the Germans have tried to do in the last few years, especially under Schroeder with these reforms when he was the chancellor. But it didn't succeed very well because, again, what they're trying to do was to layer a new system, which was basically a system without very many protections for jobs, on top of the old system, while leaving the old system more or less intact. And the result is a system which is kind of a bodge or a mess between the two. So I think that there are lessons that the US can learn from European countries, but I think that it's also a big mistake to think that there's just one single European model out there. There are a bunch of different models out there, some of which work absolutely terribly. I think Italy is a good example of this. Greece, Spain, and Spain perhaps somewhat less so, but still not wonderful. The people who the US should be learning from, I think, are really people like the Danish and the Netherlands, who I think do a very good job of combining real social protections while at the same time making sure that there's a fair amount of flexibility in labour market institutions. But that's probably more about labour market institutions than you bargained for when you started this.
No, that was actually quite interesting. But I actually think, I think my reaction is twofold. The first is that the ways in which macroeconomic policy and microeconomic policy get tied together is part of the problem, which is, in some ways, the Keynesian solution is a strictly macroeconomic solution. But a lot of what you're talking about within the Scandinavian model are the kinds of microeconomic reforms that I'm not sure if they're easier or more difficult to get through a U.S. political system. My hunch is more difficult because a macroeconomic policy, a particularly fiscal one, is one where you require basically one budget resolution. And furthermore, there's a reconciliation process where you can even bypass, if you want to, the 60% Senate rule to get past the filibuster. On the other hand, the kind of microeconomic stuff that you're talking about would require a whole cluster of reforms that would need to be passed by the United States, and that's much trickier. So that's response one. Response two is that I'm in some ways intrigued by exactly at what moment the Keynesians lost the ideal war, for lack of a better way of putting it, which is, I think, in the fall of 2008 and in early 2009, you had people of any ideological stripe in the economics profession basically saying, the moment for Keynesian stimulus is now. I remember going to a talk where Ken Rogoff is saying we've got to pump grants to states now, and if someone like Ken Rogoff is saying that, that everyone in the world is a Keynesian. What's interesting is that that's no longer the case, and I can kind of see why that is politically. I think the thing that bothers me is that policy-wise, there is a way forward where you could potentially reconcile both the immediate demand for Keynesian spending and the long-term, and I think sensible demand to get structural deficits in control. But that hasn't happened yet, which I find depressing.
Well, I think there are two things here. First, I guess the question about when did the change happen? My take on this, and it's a purely provisional take since I have to write this piece for you with John Quiggin. Hopefully we will have a more definitive take on this. I think that the real moment, the cusp at which things change is Greece. When the Greek economic crisis happens, people start to get antsy about what markets want. They start to get this idea that markets want austerity, that they want to have some sign of fiscal control, and then this becomes a self-reproducing collective wisdom in a certain sense. And I think one of the things that really has been driven home here, and this is from meeting people like Krugman, Danny Roderick, and people on the other side, is you have all of these arguments about what markets want, like Freud's famous, somewhat dubious question about what women want, and nobody knows what markets want. But what you have is a whole bunch of different people trying to put different complexions on what they think markets want in order to get policy changes that they prefer primary on the agenda as opposed to other possible changes. So I think what Greece does is it gets people antsy about this question of whether or not markets are going to be prepared to sustain certain kinds of fiscal behavior, and this this provides, I think, an opportunity for Germany, which really is, I think, I'm sort of vehemently against Keynesianism for a whole wide variety of historical reasons. Germany to really start pushing the debate in that direction in Europe, and that then I think gets transmitted back to the United States in various ways. And obviously, of course, there are a whole bunch of people in the US who have never been all that enthusiastic about fiscal stimulus spending in any event. And there was a second point that I was going to make there, but I have forgotten what it was going to be.
The point about whether, well, I mean, I guess the big question that I wonder is that I really do think, I'm not sure politically there's a way out of this, but I do think there's a policy way out of this, and in some ways to replay what happened during the early 90s when the Clinton administration came into power, which was, if you remember, when Clinton first came to office, he actually proposed a series of budgetary plans that basically would have said, I want to have a short-term stimulus boost followed by long-term deficit, cuts and deficits through things like both cutting spending and raising taxes. And, the magnitude of the problem now is much greater than it was in 93. But in some ways, you're still going to have the basic framework is there, which is the only way this is going to work is if Republicans agree that taxes are going to go up, particularly on richer people. Democrats have got to agree that Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid have got to be cut back to some extent. And then furthermore, both sides have to agree that defense spending has got to be cut. Now, if you actually manage to do those kinds of things, you would actually manage to get a grip on the sort of long-term structural deficit, which presumably would then also allow you to say we are going to engage in some continued short-term spending if the economy stays slack, and markets presumably we reassure that there was a long-term plan in place. Now, to some extent, on these sort of big-ticket questions, everything I assume is frozen in place until, I want to say, December, which is when Obama's Fiscal Commission is going to issue its report. I have to admit, I'm relatively skeptical that is actually going to generate any kind of progress whatsoever on this. But you're in D.C., so I'm kind of curious what your take is on this.
Well, my take is probably the same, that I don't think, if I think that blue ribbon commissions are, they're pretty notorious as a way of shifting uncomfortable debates out into the long grass. And I think that so we're not going to get any change on any of this until we get non-crazy Republicans. I do think that there is a real debate there about the Social Security side of things. I'm personally persuaded by the people who say that the problem is not social security spending, which has been a shibboleth of the right for a long time. It's it's really on sort of stuff on the medical side and on sort of exploding medical costs. But I remember there were two things that I wanted to say. First is, I think that the real problem in the European debate that neither Tyler nor Paul is focusing on, that I think is interesting, is the is whether or not the German model does make sense for the rest of Europe. And this is what Germany is really trying to push at the moment in the various institutional reforms that it's trying to push in the wake of the Greek crisis, to try and keep the keep economic and monetary union together. It wants to see everybody adopting very rigid domestic institutions, which would basically sort of ban deficit spending, except under truly extraordinary circumstances. And that's, I think, that's something which I'm personally somewhat skeptical about. I also think that there's a disagreement between Paul and Tyler, which hasn't really come out yet, which is really, sort of, I think a lot of their disagreement is fundamentally about whether we're in the place where fiscal policy makes sense. So whether we're in this liquidity trap where sort of lowering interest rates doesn't do any good, where monetary policy doesn't do any good. Paul seems to think that this is true of most industrialized economies. People like Martin Wolf in the Financial Times today seem to think the same thing. Whereas Tyler seems to think that this is not true of certainly of many of the economies where this stuff is being contemplated. And so I'd be interested to see an empirical debate happening between them about this. And I guess the final point is some of these micro-level supply-side stuff for training and investment and all of these good and wonderful things. I wonder whether or not there could be some sort of a quid pro quo here on trade. So the trade agenda has basically completely stalled because the left is highly suspicious of what future trade agreements are going to do to employment. I think we saw something which was much better than the piddling and underused schemes which are supposed to provide assistance for workers who've been displaced by foreign trade. If we saw a much more substantial set of social protections for retraining schemes and stuff like that, I think that you could actually create a new bargain where we would have greater free trade in exchange for greater protection and some assurance that if you lose your job in industry X, you will get some retraining for industry Y. Now again, this requires non-crazy Republicans, so I think we're going to be waiting for a while, but I think that there's at least potentially a real bargain to be struck there.
Okay, I'm going to be the pessimistic one because I actually don't think that can happen.
Okay.
I would like it to happen. I agree with you. I think that in some ways is the most sensible way out. I don't think it can happen for two reasons. The first is, as you say, I think one of the things that political scientists actually need to start studying a little more is, for lack of a better way of putting it, the long-term persistence of certain policies and certain governments that don't seem to travel terribly well. And here, by the way, I agree with you. I don't think you can export the German model to the rest of Europe, in part because in some ways I don't think the German model works if everyone applies it, because the German model is export-based. And eventually some country has to import these things. So I don't think that everyone can apply the lessons from Germany. The second is that, as and in some ways, I assume you'll be sympathetic to this argument, the conditions for the German model might be somewhat unique to Germany. It's not clear to me you can implement those institutions in other countries and actually get the same kind of policy outcomes that you've gotten in Germany. So I'm somewhat dubious, and in some ways the U.S. history on things like trade adjustment assistance and worker retraining are not glorious ones, in that most of these programs have been touted as, well, this is the solution, but any hard empirical look at the programs that are already in existence suggests that these don't work terribly well in the United States.
Now, I don't know.
Now the question is why. It might be the case that that this is just infertile soil for these kinds of programs. It might be these programs we just have to move down the learning curve and we'd eventually get better. I'm not sure, but I think because they don't work terribly well, there's not a lot of enthusiasm on either side of the aisle for them. And on the political side, I would say that it's not just that you don't just need non-crazy Republicans, you also need union Democrats committed to this kind of policy, and they're not going to like it. And the reason is because these policies inevitably transition individuals from what used to be union jobs to non-union jobs. And so as a result, to some extent for unions, this is a political life or death issue. And as a result, I don't, and I've talked to people at the AFL-CIO about trade adjustment assistance, and they admit that they always call for it in trade agreements, but you get them good and liquored up, and they'll admit the last thing they want to see is trade adjustment assistance, because then they can't fight against it, and if they get it, it's the kind of thing that slowly kills off the unions. So I'm a little more skeptical about whether or not the political conditions for the kind of grand bargain you're talking about will exist, but I would like to see them. I agree.
Well, I guess so the counter to that is that you'd want to have a system which isn't so systematically rigged against unions trying to unionize workers in the ways that the current system is. But I will agree that it would at best be a tough uphill climb.
Yeah. We have another thing to talk about, and I can't remember what
FinReg.
it was. What?
FinReg.
Oh, FinReg. Yes. Now I was out of town last week, so I know that the bill is passed. But I do think that, FinReg offers an interesting lesson to political scientists, which is, for the last year and a half, we've had to endure arguments made by our economics brethren who have suddenly discovered that there's this thing called political economy, and it turns out that really powerful interests might actually, influence the regulatory outcomes of the system. And so, I have to give Simon Johnson credit for discovering this really, really important thing that had completely escaped the attention of all of political science as we know it. But to be more serious, that economists have basically sort of applied, I guess for lack of a better way to put it, a sort of crude Marxist argument of there is no way that the government will ever regulate the capital, because government is essentially the executive committee of the bourgeoisie, and financial actors are far too powerful, even post-2008, and yet, correct me if I'm wrong, in the end we wound up with a system which is hardly perfect, but the regulatory arrangements, by and large, were surprisingly tough on things like derivatives, on ways to wind down too-big-to-fail enterprises, on consumer finance protection. And on the whole, this is a robust piece of legislation. I think even Simon Johnson acknowledged that, and probably the most serious reform of the finance sector since Glass-Steagall, which means, are these sort of, crude structural arguments potentially overstated?
Well, let me speak on behalf of the economists, because I think the economists do suck here. I hate to say this as a political scientist, but the reason that they suck is in some ways because the political scientists suck even more. And here, I think our Americanist political science brethren, it's pretty clear that Americanist political scientists have not, haven't until very, very recently really started to think about the question of what does the American political economy actually consist of, how does it work, any of these important things. And there's a piece which I would really recommend. This is in the current issue of Politics and Society. It's freely available for the next couple of months at least by Jacob Hacker and Paul Pearson, which makes this point in abundance and in profusion. Now clearly they have their own particular line of argument on this, but I think that they're absolutely they're dead right when they say that you had a sort of thriving literature in comparative politics, on comparative political economy of other countries. You had some literature in international political economy. I think it's literature both of us are dissatisfied with for various reasons, but there you go. Again, I think that literature doesn't pay as much importance or as much attention to power relations and interests as either of us would like, even if we disagree about some of how that works. But you've absolutely nothing in political science. So if the economists are sort of jumping in this with crude theories, it's because the political scientists, at least until very recently, had no theories. You did begin to see a bunch of interesting work with the Larry Bartels. You saw the Unequal Democracy book by Nolan McCarthy, Poole and Rosenthal. You have seen a bunch of maybe 3 or 4 good books in the last 4 or 5 years, plus a scattering of articles. But really this is something which Americanist political scientists have really only begun to look at. And so I think that the crudity of economists is better than saying absolutely nothing whatsoever about it. But as to why this stuff got through, I think it's a real puzzle. I think it's also a puzzle for you and me, because I think certainly you've stated publicly, and I'm not sure whether I've said it publicly, but I certainly thought it privately. I was extremely surprised that this stuff got through. I don't think it's going to work over the longer run, except in a sort of very half-hearted, haphazard kind of way. But nonetheless, I did not expect to see stuff which was as bitterly opposed by the financial industry as many of these reforms get through. So I guess the So my guess is that this really is. Here's a story that you might want to tell if you're a political scientist, which is, I think political scientists are reasonably sure that the action that happens within the system in terms of what kinds of stuff gets through and what sort of stuff does not, doesn't primarily happen at the level of when votes are taken. It happens at the stage of agenda control. In other words, potentially discomforting issues for powerful industries, powerful groups, don't really make it onto the political agenda at all. They die in committee. They're never even brought up in committee. Whatever else happens, to make sure that they don't get brought up. But this also means that you can get stuff that gets bottled up in committee for years, but then when it actually gets out there, and when people are forced to vote on it, nobody wants to be seen as voting against it. A perfect example of this in a much more trivial way is legislation on junk phone calls, on phone calls from people trying to solicit your money, solicit you for various stuff. This was bottled up for years because nobody wanted to vote for it, because the direct marketing industry had deep pockets. But once this got onto the agenda so that people had to vote, I think that there were maybe 3 or 4 Congress people who actually voted against legislation. Nobody wanted to be the person who was going to have those attack ads running in their district saying this was the person who wanted to have telemarketers calling you when you're in your bath and sort of trying to sell you whatever stupid thing it is that they wanted to sell. So I think this would be the political science story I would tell, that this is a story about what happens when agenda control breaks down, and in some ways breaks down because of some very, very specific conjunctural things. So I think an interesting counterfactual to ask is, what if Blanche Lincoln had not faced a key primary battle in her home state and had not needed to butter up the left? Would we have seen this stuff actually make it through? And I think that there's a plausible story under which we wouldn't have seen it get through the initial stages. And this story suggests that the initial stages are the crucial stages. Once it gets past that, it becomes hard for people to actually vote against.
Well, all right. I will defend the honor of political science somewhat, but not that I really disagree with anything you said. But in some ways, there has been, work on this done by political scientists. It's just much older work. I mean, the thing that I keep thinking about with regard to this is E. Schatzschneider's The Semi-Sovereign People, where Schatzschneider talks about the moments at which, if a politician is going to lose a particular, battle because within those in the know he's in the minority or she is in the minority, they can engage in something called audience expansion, which is you widen the circle of people who might have a role to play in it, and hopefully at that point you then wind up winning. I think in some ways what I would like to see political science do, because let's face it, this is clearly this is a story about one of those moments where public opinion managed to overwhelm whatever interest group pressures there were, whatever lobbying pressure there was to rein in the bill. And I think the interesting question, I think the question political scientists do need to ask, and this is a really important one, is what are the conditions under which public opinion will actually break through? Because that's not always the case. In fact, in some ways, my memory on this is that I actually did expect a relatively strong financial regulation bill in 2008. It was 2009 that I was thinking, well, the longer this drags out, the less likely that's going to be a thing, because public anger will fade. And therefore, in the end, I was surprised that it happened, because I think what I was surprised about is that the public stayed angry for so long. And so I think one of the things that I would like to see public opinion people and comparative and Americanists focus on is, to what extent, what are the issues that manage to get the American public not just exercised, but they stay exercised until they actually see something done to correct the problem. Because there's a lot of ways, and we've both seen literature about how various policies are implemented that are at odds with the public, and this is an example of democracy not working. But the fact is, on a lot of these issues, there are instances where the public might have a different preference, but they also don't care a hell of a lot. And so they're not going to, it's not issues they're going to vote for. It was clear that this did not fall under that category. And so I think it would be worth knowing what are the issues that actually get a public exercise to the point that politicians have no choice but to follow on their wishes. And that's some serious political science, I'd like to say.
Okay, but here let me push back a little bit, because I think So with a bill like this, the question that I have is not whether or not a bill like this gets through, but whether it's a bill that actually has some real and sort of effects in the financial industry. So I could see very plausibly that something called the let's reform the hell out of the financial industry and sort of give those bastards a swift sort of couple of kicks to the you-know-where bill of 2010 would have overwhelming political support. But given the strongly technical nature of many of these discussions, I don't understand this stuff particularly well, and I pretend to be a political economy type person.
Right. No.
I hate to think what the average person on the street makes of this. So the question is, why did we not see to use the language that you've used in your book, why did we not see a sham accord? Why did we not see a sham bill going through, which basically promised to do all of this kinds of stuff, but it basically created a set of schemes which were riddled with loopholes that the financial industry could could basically ride through as soon as public attention was turned away from this again. That to me is the interesting question. There, I think that the Blanche Lincoln thing, does suggest that there was. I think that there was a lot of sheer basic coincidence here. So that if Lincoln had not been challenged so hard by what's his name, this would have gone down very differently. Now, I don't think that story explains everything, because clearly there were a bunch of things that remained in the bill, even after it was clear that Lincoln had successfully seen off the primary challenger. But right. I do think that opened up the floodgates, because my memory is very clearly that at that stage, so the expectation was that Lincoln, who has historically been extremely responsive to people in the financial industry, was going to be the veto player in the committee and was going to make sure that nothing too strong got through, when she basically said, well, I want to have something that not only is that strong, but considerably stronger. I think this to me was the pivot moment at which the dynamic of the bill actually changed. And had she not been in such an uncomfortable political position, I suspect we might have seen, so she might have been the Bill Nelson of this bill rather than the person that she in fact was.
Well, I mean, in some sense, that actually is. I actually tend to agree with that to the most part, and in some ways, it accords well with sort of prior moments of legislation where you thought things were going to go in one direction and they wind up going another. And the example I always think of is the '86 tax reform, where, what the initial goal that the Reagan administration wanted was to literally simplify the tax code, that it had become so riddled with loopholes and exemptions that it was no longer coherent, and that this was his big signature second term push. And there was a version that got through the House that was, not that much better. And it looked like the same thing was going to happen in the Senate. And then suddenly Bob Packwood sort of had a come to Jesus moment where he said, you know what, I'm just sick of this. And I'm actually going to, do what the Reagan administration wants. And that led to a sort of snowball effect where everyone said, well, if we're really going to get rid of everything, let's get rid of almost everything. And so as a result, the final bill wound up looking much better, I think, than anyone had anticipated. And so in some sense, I think a similar thing happened here. Which is, I agree with you, a little bit disturbing, because it basically requires a model where we predict at what point will pivotal political players have come to Jesus moments where they say, you know what, we actually have to do the responsible thing. And so let's face it, that these are idiosyncratic moments, and I'm not sure you can come up with that kind of theory. But it might be worth wondering whether or not there are certain structural circumstances where everyone recognizes the problem is so big that the odds that one of these players will have one of these moments is a pretty decent one. And so this is why I perhaps might be a little more hopeful on the national security reform side than I otherwise would be, which is maybe it's possible that one of the key players will, after reading these post-exposés and sort of, recognizing that the public is getting profoundly fatigued by these kind of national security bloated bureaucracies, will say, you know what, enough is enough. I don't care if I get attacked as soft on terror. It's time we actually have to have a public debate about this.
Well, let's hope that they come to Jesus, or I don't know if this means that you're a Jew for people coming to Jesus, but...
Come to Jesus, come to Buddha, come to Muhammad. I come to Yahweh. I'm not going to.
You're an equal opportunity.
I'm an equal opportunity hoper of born again politics, I guess.
Okay, so finally, and sort of talking about people, you're sort of coming to this, that, and the other. I think you wanted to talk a little bit about the World Cup effect and Spanish politics.
Just a closing note of pessimism while we're on the topic, where again, first of all, congratulations to Spain on their World Cup victory last week. That was hard earned, and they beat what I can only describe as a really dirty Dutch team. Managed to win, even though that had been the first time they'd even been to a World Cup final. I just want to squelch quickly, however, there was immediately after that a lot of punditry about how this was, going to be a moment where Spain truly came together as a country, despite the fact that Spain had been split apart, has been split apart numerous times by regionalism in the form of the Basque separatists and Catalan nationalists and so forth. And, when that happened, all I kept thinking about was, how everyone said the same thing in France 12 years ago when France won the World Cup in '98 with a very multicultural team. And it was proclaimed that this was, France's true moment where they would celebrate, its diversity and yet still be singularly French. And, of course, anyone who's paid attention to the French national team during this World Cup would know that, that's very, very quickly faded. Similarly, in 2006, there was a lot of talk about how the Germans who had hosted the World Cup had a great national moment because for once it was okay for everyone in Germany to root for Germany. Everyone else seemed to be okay with that and wasn't that nice and peachy. And, of course, now there's a lot of brewing anti-German resentment in the rest of Europe. So I am unfortunately profoundly confident that Spain's newfound unity will not last that long.
I think that's probably, certainly based on the French thing, that's probably right. But you actually do see this stuff it does occasionally work. And Germany is an interesting example of that. When I lived in Germany, this was back in 2002, we had a big match, I think it was in the European Cup maybe it was a World Cup qualifier, between Germany and Turkey. I lived in Bonn at the time, which had a large Turkish population, and the hostility on the street was pretty extraordinary. So you just got the sense of this was also a pretty brutal time. Germany had some particularly nasty citizenship laws, which made it difficult for Turks to become full citizens. There was in general, a pretty unpleasant debate going on, but you just felt the racial tension. And when the match was actually played out, it was very definitely played out as a grudge match. And the fact that and this, I'm not saying it's because of football, but you do see that the fact that the German team is integrated now and has has some Turkish players. My understanding from friends in Germany is that Turkish people are actually rooting for the German team in a way which they simply did not 10 or 12 years back. I don't think this is necessarily because of sport. There's a whole bunch of other stuff that's happened in the interim, but it at least is a kind of a form of expression of that. That said, so football is I think war by other means. I certainly remember when I was growing up in Ireland, the first time that people actually took pride in the Irish football team, the Irish soccer team, was back the time that we beat Britain. It beat England by a fairly in a fairly whomping victory for the very first time ever. Before that, soccer had been a hated sport of the English colonial oppressor. Now that we could actually beat the bastards in it, it became a major source of national pride and happiness. And on that note, I'll also say that I had a certain amount of schadenfreude about the French team doing so miserably, given that the only reason that they had damn well gotten in there in the first place, it was through a foul upon an Irish player, which was not picked up. So.
No, I know, and you have my sympathy on this point, and I have to admit, I think two of the things that I wanted to really see go down during the World Cup did, which was namely the French national team and Diego Maradona. So on the whole, I think it was actually quite a good World Cup, and thankfully no more vuvuzelas.
Okay, well, I think that's probably all we have to say on the world for this time.
Henry, always a pleasure.
Great to talk to you.
All right, take care. Bye.
Bye.
Hello, Henry. How are you doing?
Not too bad. Surviving the summer Washington heat.
Oh, yes. I just got back from Europe last week where they had to deal with European heat. It was just as hot there as it was here.
I don't know about that. I think Washington heat is particularly miserable and particularly humid. You were in France, was it, or...?
I was in Italy and then somewhat involuntarily in France due to the sublime incompetence of Air France. But in Italy, it was 95 to 99. But you're right, there wasn't that much humidity. And at Paris, I have to admit, the weather was lovely, so no complaints there.
And Italy has compensating advantages that I'm afraid Washington D.C., while it's a very nice city, does not.
This is quite true, and yeah, there's no denying that. But having gotten back here, I now see that this morning I wake up and there is a big story in the Washington Post.
A pretty enormous story. I think it's a fun story and an interesting story, and of course the first installment of what seems to be a set of sort of very interesting pieces. Mark Ambinder had a piece suggesting that all of Washington was on tenterhooks, waiting to see what happened. I think you had a blog post more or less along the same lines this morning.
Yes. So I mean, this is a mother of a piece. I mean, it's 4,500 words at least, and this is just part one, and it appears to be part of a 2-year effort by Dana Priest and Bill Arkin from the Washington Post. I have to say, Dana Priest in particular is a reporter without peer. She was the reporter who I believe broke the rendition story, the sort of black sites for rendition of terrorist suspects. So the story is about I guess for lack of a better putting it, this sort of SCIF complex, the national security complex that has been created in the wake of the 9/11 attacks and exists.
This is, I guess, so this certainly rings true to me from what I know of the bureaucratic backstory. The one thing I would have liked to have seen more of in the piece, and perhaps that comes later, is an account of the more specific account of the bureaucratic fights that led up to this. Because really, I think a lot of this, it's a response to the failures of the September 11th Commission agenda to actually take place. Basically, what you had, the September 11th Commission rightly recognized all of these problems of people not talking to each other, stovepiping, institutional proliferation and whatever, and said that they wanted to create a new structure with the Director of National Intelligence, which was supposed to bring all of this stuff to organize it and to make sure that some of this redundancy got eliminated. But they made it absolutely clear, and the chairs made it absolutely clear that this position was only going to work if this position had real clout, which means, of course, in bureaucratic terms, it would have A, control over who gets what money, and B, over who gets hired and fired in the different agencies. And Donald Rumsfeld didn't like this. He fought an extremely successful bureaucratic rearguard action. Rumsfeld, of course, being a notoriously proficient bureaucratic infighter, to make sure that the Director of National Intelligence position got gutted. And so I think a lot of what we see here, this proliferation, is a response to the failure a number of years ago to try and impose some order on this, and the incentives that this offers, as you say, for everybody, every Tom, Dick and Harry in the military, and also in other parts of the intelligence community, to create their own private fiefdoms and empire without any real supervision.
I think it's even worse than that, because the other thing that I think the most interesting details in the story that was out today was the notion that after every subsequent failure, what would inevitably happen is that people would go in front of Congress and say, well, you know what, we need to set up a special task force to deal with this particular terrorism problem. And of course,
there's the ways, and again, that I hope gets developed more in the later forms of the piece, is the dysfunctional relationship between huge parts of the defense community and Congress. And here, we're not only talking about missile programs or fighter programs or whatever, we're talking about these programs as also being a way of handing out the pork. Late unlamented John Mercer was up to his eyes in a whole bunch of this stuff. There's some pretty dubious Beltway bandit companies, which, as I recall, relocated in his district specifically to take advantage of boondoggles that he set up. And so a lot of these programs are, I think, pretty directly the result of some sort of congenial political relationships, which I really don't think are going to get sorted out. And this is also, I think, one of the clarion calls of conservatives is always to eliminate government waste, but when it comes to cutting stuff that's happening through the Pentagon, they tend to back off pretty quickly. And this, I think, is the paradigmatic example of how what happens within this area, which really is sort of terribly murky because the lines of responsibility are so attenuated,
Yeah.
because so much of this stuff is happening either in the black budget or in places that are not easily exposed to the sort of public light. It becomes very, very easy for all sorts of crazy and wasteful stuff to happen without anybody actually observing. I think the classic example of this a number of years ago was that incredibly gold-plated headquarters which the National Reconnaissance Agency managed to build for itself. So with some sort of, as I recall, literally sort of hundreds of millions of dollars being spent on sort of pretty ludicrously over built luxurious quarters, and so because it's part of the black budget, nobody much notices. There's not much sort of public debate, and so it's very easy for
this sort of multi-hydra-headed operation consisting of over 1,200 government agencies and I believe over 1,400 private sector agencies, all of which are devoted to either homeland security, counterterrorism, or intelligence. And basically the broad brushstrokes of the story is that the system is completely beyond control. And I don't mean that in the sense of beyond control in that it's devouring everything. It's beyond control in the sense of no one seems to be able to have a grip on the massive inflows of information that are coming in. And then the story also talks about the sort of absurdities that have cropped up as a result of the past 9 years. Things like 4-star generals insisting that they have their own intelligence and security apparatus because every other 4-star general has one. And the sort of standard bureaucratic mythologies that take place when you've got large amounts of ready cash flowing around. There was some concern, I think, before the story was coming out that this was going to be a national security breach of some kind. But I have to say, one of the refreshing things I've seen so far, at least in today's reaction to the story, is that everyone across the political spectrum agrees this wasn't a national security breach. They got everything from open source sites, and that it's a useful flashlight onto an area where not a lot of people know a great deal.
Well, one of the things I thought was most interesting about the story was the graph that went along with it. Chris Shea has a blog, Brainiac, where he basically said that the interesting thing about the graph is precisely how incomprehensible it is, and how impossible it was for the Washington Post's graphics people very clearly to actually give you an illustration which showed you what the hell this was going on. So you get this graph, this chart, and which really gives you an impression of overwhelming and incomprehensible bureaucratic activity. And I think
we need more resources thrown at it. And I've got this laundry list of policies that we had always wanted implemented anyway, and now would be a great time to implement them. So, after the Nigerian, for example, who got exposed on Christmas Day, trying to explode up the airliner, you see this sort of thing happen. You saw it happen. I assume you're going to see it happen after the Times Square incident. And in some ways, this is a replay that goes back to the initial USA Patriot Act, which was passed only a month after 9/11, and which in many ways really consisted of sort of a laundry list of various agencies' wish lists in terms of getting access to information. And let me add, by the way, that in saying this, some of these instances were quite well supported. I mean, there was valid reasons for having this passed, but in some ways, they didn't have anything new in these requests. These were old requests that simply because the political environment had changed, were then able to get them. So, I mean, in some ways, the disturbing thing is the pathology seems to repeat itself over and over and over again. And then the question, of course, is, and I'd be very curious to see what the political impact of these stories will have on the existing national security apparatus. I have to say, one of the things, again, I really do find mildly encouraging so far, and again, this is just based on the first cycle of reactions, is I haven't seen a partisan split on this thing. I've seen both, sort of conservatives and liberals saying this is something we got to take seriously.
I guess I'm a little more skeptical than you on that, because I don't think that there's, I don't think there's a partisan split on this, but so I think that the issue of sort of big ticket reform for this, it's kind of like the issue of yes, we need to reform waste in government. Everybody agrees in abstract, getting rid of waste in government is absolutely awesome, but when you get to cut down to the specifics, people, so every program has its institutional defender, and one of the things that is really I think very clear